And so the first two stories that I really like to touch upon, Professor, is Surat al-Falaq and Surat al-Nas. The daybreak and mankind or humankind, however we want to translate it. You mentioned in the book that these two surahs do not challenge Tawheed, the doctrine of oneness, but they actually problematize it. So, can you help us understand why these two surahs are problematize the doctrine of oneness? The concept of Tawheed. Do please walk us through that.
First of all, I should say that this not only the first chapter in the book, but it's the first chapter I actually wrote. So it's the first thing I ever wrote about the Quran. So it was and the reason I picked it was because the strangeness of them, of this world that was depicted in these two surahs, of human beings just surrounded by all of these malevolent forces that are threatening to break in and pleading with God to protect them from these things. So why do I say that it's problematizing monotheism? Well, what happened to all of the gods that the people in Arabia worshipped? Well, the most obvious monotheistic answer to that is they do not exist and they never existed. That would be the orthodox, pious, monotheistic answer, and you get a similar answer from Jews and Christians as you would from Muslims. However, that's not the only answer that the Quran gives, because in a lot of cases, these figures that had been God's figures that had been, people had worshipped them, people had brought petitions to them, they prayed to them. Well, the Quran don't exist. The Quran demotes them, makes them powerless, makes them subservient to the one God. So that's what I mean by problematizing. That the figures still exist, as pictured by the Quran, is filled with these invisible spiritual creatures. And Orthodoxy says that they were made by God, so they had to be. But they're still around. And that's what I mean by problematizing. These guys are still around, and the Quran has to deal with that. And they don't only deal with it by saying they don't exist. They also deal with it by they're not so powerful. That would be my the jinn chapter particularly goes into that, war in heaven. So anyway, that's what I mean by problematizing.
Correct. Right.
And those are the last two surahs in the Quran. A really good example of that, because it's a universe, it's a frightening universe. It's people with all of these malevolent beings that are trying to get them, and it even seems to implicate God in some of these terrifying things that are happening. So it's monotheistic, but it's a complex monotheism. It's not a pure monotheism where the only supernatural creature of any account is the one God. It's more complex than that.
For sure, absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's really well said, Professor. And once again, from my limited knowledge of the Hebrew Bible and Judeo-Christian history, there's something else that I wanted to ask, Professor. I mean, would you say that the Judaism is more henotheistic than monotheistic, or I mean, we do have the Hebrew Bible saying, one of the 10 commandments being that thou shalt not have any other gods besides Yahweh. And so that sort of presupposes that these other gods do exist. And so you go from a polytheistic worldview to a henotheistic worldview, which is the worship of a primary God. And then perhaps the next step on the evolutionary ladder is pure monotheism, which Islam brings. So with that in context, I mean, would you say that these early Meccan surahs, Daybreak and Nas, humanity, is probably trying to sift through that primordial henotheism to true monotheism? How would you look at it in that context?
Well, the last thing you said is very interesting, but I want to get to the earlier things you said first. Your definition of henotheism is fine. I would maybe add it's the existence of many gods, the worship of only one. And I would say you're completely accurate that the Hebrew Bible tends towards a henotheistic view of the world. a book I wrote was called Twilight of the Gods. It's just on that very topic.
Mhm.
I wouldn't say that Judaism is henotheistic, because Judaism develops out of the Hebrew Bible, but moves further in the direction of absolute monotheism. So Judaism, I wouldn't call henotheistic.
Right.
But the last thing you said is really interesting. Is to tie in verse with a struggle with henotheism, and you're taking what I said and you're taking it a little bit further, and I want to think about that. But that's a really interesting idea. I'm taking it in that direction, but I think that's worth considering.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, if you're if there is something that I've been able to help you, think further about, Professor, then I'm
Yeah.
probably doing my job as a host. But you're too kind. Thank you so much for that, Professor. But so, Professor, having said all that, there's something else that I wanted to just ask you, for the benefit of our viewers and listeners. These last two surahs or chapters, and again, a lot of people believe that they're very early Meccan. But was there ever any kind of sort of controversy as to whether they ought to be included in the final canon of the Quran? I think you mentioned something like that in the book, correct?
Yes, there was a controversy about those two, because uh, they I mean I'm not going to get into the whole chronology stuff. What's early, what's late, but
Right.
they do represent a certain approach to religion, which we would identify more as folk religion,
Mm,
than the more elevated philosophical theology that we might see
right.
in some other parts of the Bible, and you see that all over the Bible as well, and
Mm,
things that later biblical writers would be horrified by, and they have to explain it away.
right.